The fireplace crackled, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a mournful sound that made the old timber frame creak and groan. The blizzard had been raging for 2 days now, and there was no sign of it letting up. Grandfather leaned forward in his rocking chair, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. Across from him, his grandson Tommy sat cross-legged on the bearskin rug, wide-eyed and eager. Behind Grandfather, his shadow stretched against the wall. "You sure you want to hear this story, boy? It's not for the faint of heart." Grandfather's voice was like gravel underfoot, worn smooth by years and whiskey. Tommy nodded eagerly. "I'm 12 now, Grandpa." "I'm not scared. 12 is a good age," Grandfather nodded once. "Strong enough to hear hard truths." He took a long sip from his steaming mug. "Time you learned about the Wendigo, the monster from the stories?" Tommy's voice betrayed a hint of nervousness despite his bravado. "Not just stories. The Wendigo is real." Grandfather's eyes caught the firelight, reflecting it strangely. "I've met it more than once. Escaped by luck and nothing else." He leaned closer. "Want to hear about it?" Tommy nodded, pulling his blanket tighter around his shoulders. "All right then. But remember this: it listens. It watches. Even now." Grandfather glanced toward the window, where snow pelted against the glass like tiny desperate fists. Especially in storms, Grandfather settled deeper into his chair, his eyes growing distant as he sank into memories. The cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the very walls were leaning in to listen. "The most recent time was about 15 years ago, before you were born. I was working as a forest ranger up near the Canadian border. Beautiful country, but lonely. My cabin was the only human dwelling for 20 miles in any direction. Winter came early that year. By late October, we were already snowed in. Supply drops came by helicopter once a month, but a storm rolled in just when I was expecting a drop. Radio communication went down too. I was completely cut off. After a couple days, my food was running low. The weather was still too bad for supplies. That's when I first noticed the tracks outside my cabin, like deer hooves, but larger, deeper. They circled the entire perimeter, as if something had been pacing, looking for a way in. That night, I heard knocking at my door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. "Hello," called a voice. "Is anyone there? I'm a hiker. I got lost in the storm." Now, I knew that wasn't possible. No hiker could have made it through that blizzard. And the nearest trail was miles away. But the voice, there was something about it that pulled at me. Something familiar I couldn't quite place. "I can see your chimney smoke," the voice called. "Please, I'm freezing out here." Something felt wrong. The voice was too calm for someone who'd been wandering in a blizzard. But even stranger, it seemed to know things it shouldn't. "I can see you sitting by your radio," it said. "The one with the broken antenna. I can help fix it." I hadn't told anyone about the broken antenna. Hadn't had a chance to. I approached the window instead, thinking I'd get a look before deciding. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. My breath clouded before my face, and the fire dimmed as if starved for air. Through the frost-covered glass, I could make out a figure in the moonlight. A man in hiking gear, his back to me, looking out at the forest. As if sensing my gaze, he began to turn. I ducked away before seeing his face. Some instinct warned me not to look. In the window's reflection, I glimpsed something tall behind the hiker, something with a crown of shadows that moved like antlers. "I know you're in there," the voice said, suddenly right at the window. "Why won't you help me?" I sat with my back against the wall, beneath the windowsill, heart pounding. "The ranger station is 2 miles south," I lied. "Follow the trail markers with reflectors." Silence followed. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a soft laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air filled with a scent like frozen pine needles and something else, something metallic and ancient. "But you're here," the voice said, softer now. "And I'm so hungry." All night it stayed outside, sometimes knocking, sometimes calling in different voices a woman, a child, an old man. Always knowing details it shouldn't, the titles of books on my shelf, where I kept my spare keys, the name of my childhood dog. By dawn, the noises stopped. When I finally looked outside, the strange tracks were gone, filled in by fresh snow. But at the edge of the clearing stood a single birch tree that hadn't been there the day before. The storm broke that afternoon. A helicopter came with supplies the next day. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? Tommy stared at the window, as if expecting to see something there. The fire popped suddenly, making him jump. Outside, the wind seemed to pause, as if listening. But you'd seen it before? Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grandfather's eyes grew distant again. The lines in his face deepened as he nodded slowly. Yes. He took a slow breath before continuing, rolling back the years with each word. It finds those who are alone in the wild. And it's patient, so very patient, his gaze focused on something far beyond the cabin walls. I was in my 30s, back in the 1970s. I worked for a nature magazine, traveling to remote places to take photographs. That particular winter, I was assigned to capture the northern lights in the Minnesota wilderness. The editor wanted something special: aurora borealis reflecting off pristine, untouched snow. No cabins, no roads, nothing man-made in the frame. Just pure wilderness under those dancing lights. The kind of shot that makes you feel tiny in the universe. I packed enough supplies for 2 weeks and hired a bush pilot to drop me at a remote lake 30 miles from the nearest town. The pilot thought I was crazy going alone in January. Radio check-in every night at 7. He insisted. Missed 2 in a row, and I'm coming to get you. Pictures be damned, the first few days were magical. Complete solitude. The silence of those woods, you can't imagine it, Tommy. Not silence like an empty room. Silence like the world before humans existed. I'd spend all day scouting locations, then set up my cameras at dusk and wait through the frigid nights for the lights to appear. On the 4th night, the aurora was spectacular, curtains of green and purple rippling across the stars. I was moving between my 3 camera setups when I noticed something odd. A dark patch in the snow about 100 yards out on the frozen lake. I was certain it hadn't been there during my setup. Through my telephoto lens, I could just make out a figure standing perfectly still. A person, facing away from shore, looking up at the sky. My first thought was relief, another photographer. Even brief company would have been welcome after days alone. I called out, but my voice seemed swallowed by the vastness. The sound traveled wrong, as if the words froze before they could reach across the ice. I decided to approach. The ice was thick enough to hold a truck this time of year, so I wasn't worried about that. But with each step I took toward the figure, the temperature dropped noticeably. My eyelashes began to frost over. And something felt increasingly wrong. It never moved, not even slightly. No shifting of weight, no turning at the sound of my crunching footsteps. And strangest of all, no breath cloud in the bitter air. About halfway across the lake, I stopped. Some primal instinct told me to go no farther. I raised my camera instead and took a series of photographs with my flash. The figure still didn't turn, but it changed somehow. Even from behind, I could tell its proportions were wrong, too tall now. Too thin, its head oddly shaped. A cloud passed over the moon, plunging the lake into momentary darkness. When moonlight returned, the figure was gone. The dark patch in the snow remained. I retreated to my tent, heart pounding. For hours, I heard footsteps circling, sometimes near, sometimes far, but always returning. The air in my tent filled with that same scent, frozen pine and something older, something that didn't belong in this century. Toward dawn, the footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. Then came a soft voice, barely above a whisper, "Your cameras are still out there. Don't you want to collect them before the snow comes?" I remained silent, paralyzed with fear. "I've seen what you're trying to capture," the voice continued. "But your photographs will never show the true beauty of this place. I could show you perspectives you've never imagined." The voice was gentle, almost hypnotic. Despite my terror, I found myself reaching for the tent zipper. A sudden gust of wind shook the tent, breaking the spell. I huddled in my sleeping bag until sunrise, radio clutched to my chest, too frightened even to call for help. In the morning, I found my cameras untouched. Around my tent were those distinctive tracks like deer hooves but impossibly large and deep. They led to each camera, lingered, then continued to my tent before disappearing into the tree line. When I developed the film later, every shot of the northern lights showed the same thing, a tall, antlered silhouette at the frame's edge, just barely visible against the stars. In each sequential photo, it was closer to the camera position. In the final frame, it stood directly behind the tripod, its elongated shadow stretching toward the lens. The strangest photo, though, was one I didn't remember taking. A self-portrait, apparently triggered by the timer, showing me standing at the lake's edge, looking out at the ice. Behind me, half hidden in shadow, stood something impossibly tall with a hand not quite a hand reaching toward my shoulder. But what truly chilled me was my own expression in the photo, serene, almost joyful, as if I was about to step into an embrace. I never showed those photos to anyone. But I keep them still, as a reminder of what waits in the wilderness for those who wander too far alone. Tommy's eyes were wide now, his earlier bravado gone. "Can I see the photos?" Grandfather's expression softened strangely. "Sure." Once we're home, Tommy shifted under his blanket, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. A silence settled between them, filled only by the soft popping of the fire and the distant moan of the wind. The grandfather's eyes lingered on the boy's face, studying his reaction as if searching for something. "There was another time," Grandfather said finally, his voice lower now, almost reverent. "Earlier still. When I was younger than your father is now." He leaned back, his silhouette merging with the shadows behind him. "Each encounter was different, you see. It learns. It adapts. But it always hungers." I had taken a job as a fur trapper to save money for college. I had a line of traps spanning several miles through the northern woods. One December day, a blizzard blew in while I was checking my far traps. I knew I wouldn't make it back to my cabin before nightfall, so I headed for an old emergency shelter that the previous trapper had built, just a small shack with a wood stove. The wind had a voice that day. Not just howling, but something more articulate, almost like words just beyond understanding. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling watched, though nothing was visible through the thickening snow. I was about a mile from the shelter when I noticed someone walking ahead of me on the trail, another trapper by the look of him, hunched against the wind. The sight of him was strange, though. In such a whiteout, he should have been a barely visible silhouette, but I could see him with unusual clarity, as if he existed separately from the storm around him. "Hello there," I called, but my voice was lost in the wind. I tried to catch up, but no matter how fast I walked, he remained the same distance ahead, always just visible enough to follow. It struck me as odd that I never got closer, but I was grateful for the company and the broken trail through deepening snow. He led me straight to the shelter. When I arrived, the door was ajar, but there was no one inside. No footprints led away from the door either, just my own tracks arriving, and those I had followed, which mysteriously ended at the threshold. Inside, I found the wood stove already lit and warm, a pot of stew bubbling on top. A single wooden chair was pulled up to the small table, as if awaiting a guest. On the table sat a pocket watch I recognized immediately. It had belonged to my grandfather. I'd left it at home, 100 miles away. The air in the shelter smelled different from the snow outside, older, earthier, with that same metallic undertone I'd come to recognize years later. I was starving and cold, so despite my unease, I sat and ate. The stew was unlike anything I'd tasted, rich and satisfying in a way that seemed to warm me from the inside out. I emptied the pot and promptly fell into the deepest sleep of my life. I dreamed of running through the forest on 4 legs, tireless and free, under a full moon. Of knowing every shadow and hollow of the woods as intimately as the lines on my own palm. In the dream, I wasn't alone. There were others running with me, their forms shifting between human and something else entirely. When I woke the next morning, the blizzard had passed. The wood stove was cold, as if it hadn't been lit in weeks. The pot was gone, and in its place lay a small, yellowed human tooth. "You understand, don't you?" Grandfather asked softly. "You feel it too?" The call of the winter woods. Tommy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Sometimes I dream about running through snow. But I'm not scared in the dreams. I feel free." Grandfather's smile deepened. "Of course you do. The wild is freeing." Grandfather fell silent, staring into the fire. Outside, the wind had died down, as if the storm itself was listening, waiting for the final tale. "More?" Tommy asked quietly, his voice small yet eager despite the fear that had crept into it. Something in his eyes reflected his grandfather's gaze, a curiosity that ran deeper than caution. "One last story," Grandfather said, his tone changing, as if he were speaking from a place more primal than memory. "The first time, I was 8 years old," he began, his clipped style softening slightly. "Lived in a small house at the edge of town. My bedroom window faced the woods. One winter night, I woke to tapping on my window. Like fingernails on glass. I was scared, but curiosity pulled stronger. I looked through the curtains. In the moonlight stood Billy Mercer, a boy from my school. He'd gone missing 3 days earlier during a family camping trip. "Let me in," he said. His breath didn't fog the glass despite the cold. "I've been lost in the woods. Found my way back, but my parents aren't home." Something was wrong. His eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. His clothes were too clean, the same ones from when he disappeared. I told him I'd wake my parents so they could call his family. "No," he said sharply. "Don't wake them. Just let me in. I'm cold." He pressed his hand against the glass. His fingers were too long, the joints bent strangely. I backed away. His face changed then, not angry, but deeply sad. Like he'd lost something precious. "Don't you want to play in the woods with me?" he asked. "I've found the most wonderful places." As he spoke, I caught my own reflection in the glass, overlaying his face. For just a moment, we blended together. I ran for my parents. When they checked, nothing was there, just strange tracks in the snow. Next day at school, they announced they'd found Billy's coat. Never found Billy himself. When spring came and snow melted, hikers found a cave in the forest. Inside were children's things arranged like a tea party. My jacket was there too. But I'd never lost it. Grandfather's eyes seemed to look inward. Sometimes, I still see him. In still water. In dark windows. Watching. The fire had burned low. The cabin felt cold now. Tommy's blanket pulled tight. "Why do we come here every winter? To remember." Grandfather's smile didn't reach his eyes. He added a log to the fire. Flames lit his face different now. Tommy saw the deep shadows in his grandfather's eyes. How they caught light but didn't hold it. "The forest is a lonely place," Grandfather said, words sparse like the trees in snow. Cold. Silent. Vast. He stood with strange grace. Moved to the window. His outline against the glass seemed wrong somehow. Too tall. Too angular. "Those stories are true." His voice held echoes. Other voices beneath. But the endings might not be. Tommy watched his grandfather's hands. Had his fingers always been that long? That oddly bent? He turned to Tommy, hand extended. "You hear them too?" The woods calling. Outside, the snow had stopped. The pines stood dark and waiting. The fire burned out. Shadows danced on walls. Like antlers. By morning, fresh tracks led away from the cabin door, one set large and strange, the other small and human, walking side by side into the endless white of the winter woods.